Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar organized by the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition in collaboration with the Linguistic Society of America. I am Michel DeGraff. I am a professor of linguistics at MIT and a representative of the Linguistic Society of America in the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition. I'll be leading today's webinar together with Jessica Wyndham. Jessica is the Associate Director of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law Program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Jessica is a human rights attorney by training for almost a decade. She has worked at AAAS to bridge the human rights and scientific communities. She oversees the various human rights activities at the organization, and she coordinates the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition on which I served. In that capacity, Jessica has led efforts to bring the perspectives of scientists and engineers together in order to help the UN define the human rights to science. This right to science is a key provision of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We will hear more about these efforts during this webinar.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to be a part of this discussion, and I'm very grateful to the Linguistic Society of America for making this happen. So with that, let me just explain a few technical matters. Only speakers will be microphone enabled for this webinar. However, there are several times during the webinar when we invite questions from participants. To submit your questions, type them into the Q&A box at any time. The webinar will be recorded and you will each get a link to the recording with the PowerPoints in the next day or two. So, enough about logistics. Let's get started. Over the course of the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be focusing on the 5 principal connections between linguistics and human rights, starting with a brief introduction about human rights generally. But before we launch into that, we'll start with a quick poll. Wonderful. Okay, so as we can see, almost 3/4, just over 3/4 of those participating in the webinar see a connection between linguistics and human rights in their work, which is absolutely wonderful. And maybe through the course of this webinar, you'll see even more connections. There are some who aren't sure and some who don't yet see a connection. Well, hopefully through this webinar, we'll help you explore some of the ways in which human rights connect with your work and with linguistics broadly. So, to build a foundation for our discussion about the connections between linguistics and human rights, let's start by what we mean by this term. When we say human rights, we're talking about fundamental entitlements that are guaranteed by law, that is, international, regional, and domestic laws. They're inherent to all human beings on an equal and non-discriminatory basis, and they're derived from the mere fact of being human. It's the obligation of governments to ensure the realization of human rights, but at the same time, we all have a role to play in ensuring the enjoyment of human rights by everyone. Now, when talking about modern human rights law, the starting point is always the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document drafted by the UN Human Rights Commission, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. The original idea was that the declaration be a legally binding document, but there was a political and a philosophical divide at the time it was being drafted, with the East being more in favor of protecting economic, social, and cultural rights, and the West favoring protection of civil and political rights. The final result was the adoption of a non-binding declaration and the development of 2 binding but separate treaties on each set of rights. These 2 treaties are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, both adopted in 1966. The first recognizes, for example, the right to life, to freedom from torture, to a fair trial, and to information, freedom of expression and association. And for many of you, I suspect these rights will be quite familiar. Indeed, in most cases, they're probably rights contained in your national constitution. On the other hand, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights recognizes, for example, the rights to work, to housing, to health, to education, to an adequate standard of living, to culture, and to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its application. Already, perhaps, you're beginning to see some connections between these rights covered by international law and the work of linguists. These treaties and other human rights instruments that form part of the body of international law make some reference to language, as indicated here in quotes taken from some of those treaties. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, in a provision mirrored in many other human rights documents, prohibits discrimination, including on the ground of language. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights stipulates that minorities have a right to use their own language. The Convention on the Rights of the Child requires that the education of children be directed toward the development of respect for a child's own culture and language. And the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities goes into some detail about the ability of persons to communicate, defining forms of communication and language, including sign languages and other forms of non-spoken languages. What is more, it's worthwhile noting the existence of international and regional human rights documents that address language and linguistic rights specifically. The main documents of relevance are the Universal Declaration on Linguistic Rights, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, and the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. While in many cases these are not treaties and therefore do not create legal obligations, they are statements of principle which are intended to guide policy and program development. So that's a very brief review of what is meant by human rights. Can we clarify anything for you at this point? We'll take a few questions, and let me just remind you briefly that you can ask questions by typing into the question pane. So we have several questions here. One is, has the US ratified these treaties? So, as I mentioned, there are two main treaties. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been ratified. That is, countries have voluntarily said they will be legally bound by it. In the case of 167 countries, and the US is one of them. The US has not ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. 160 governments have, not the US. The US has also ratified the Convention Against Torture and also the Convention on the Elimination of Race Discrimination. Another good question that's come in is, who enforces violations of these treaties and how? That's a very challenging question in the sense that the answer is very much context specific. So technically, each of these treaties has a committee that's responsible for monitoring implementation. And that treaty receives reports from governments as well as civil society about implementation by each country. And it makes recommendations for how the country can better ensure it meets its obligations. But in practice, as you might imagine, those recommendations are often ignored. So that's why it's very important that at the domestic level, international laws are incorporated into domestic law, and that civil society organizations work actively on the ground to educate others about the rights and the obligations of government to protect those rights and to enforce them at a domestic level. We will take just one further question before we move on. Do political participation and voting rights fall under human rights? The answer is a definite yes. They come under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Sometimes in the United States, for example, the terminology of civil rights is used. Civil rights is a subset of human rights, and it's particularly focused on issues such as political participation and voting. But they are certainly human rights under international law. So we will move on, but there'll be other opportunities for questions as the webinar continues. So with that brief introduction to human rights, let's now turn to the 5 ways in which linguistics can have a role in human rights. First, we'll focus on responding to violations of the rights of linguists.
There are several organizations that are concerned about the persecution of scientists, engineers, and health professionals generally. There are others that will respond in the case of persecuted linguists specifically. In case you're asking yourself whether, in fact, linguists have faced persecution, here is one example that you may well have read about already. Abdouali Ayoup is an Uyghur linguist who got his degree from the University of Kansas. Then he went back to Xinjiang, China, to open an Uyghur language kindergarten. He chose to have the kindergarten in Uyghur instead of Chinese so the children could learn better in their native languages. In China, Uyghur children are typically educated in Chinese, Mandarin, and forced to assimilate in Chinese culture. This is part of a general campaign against the Uyghurs' language, culture, and religion. Abdouali Ayoup was arrested in August 2013 and accused of, quote, illegal fundraising, unquote, for his school project. Luckily, Ayoup was later on released in November 2014.
Thank you for that example, Michel. Here we all have an opportunity for action. You can work with your professional association to raise awareness about the persecution of specific linguists and write letters on their behalf or take other appropriate action. Do you have any questions about protecting the rights of linguists? As we move into the Q&A, let me remind you that you can ask questions by typing into the question pane. So we have a question here relating to action in response to persecuted scientists and whether writing letters is always the most appropriate response. It's a good question because we have to be very careful when we're responding to potential rights violations or violations of the rights of individuals, being sensitive to the context of a particular case. Letter writing is certainly a traditional and often quite public method for getting a lot of people involved in support of one particular case, but it's not always either the only or the best approach. Sometimes diplomatic approaches, whether from country to country or a particularly invested civil society organization approaching either the government directly or the embassy of the government in question in the country, may be more appropriate. Sometimes broad public campaigns that gain a lot of attention will be effective, but sometimes that may backfire. And so making sure that you're in contact with all of the relevant individuals in a particular case who can advise as to appropriate responses is key. We have another question here too. Are there any specific organizations that work to defend persecuted linguists? Can you give an example? So on the slide that we showed previously, in fact, I'll go back to it, you'll see in the heading there the logos of several organizations: Scholars at Risk, the Linguistic Society of America, and the Committee of Concerned Scientists. These are some organizations. Obviously, the Linguistic Society focuses specifically on linguists. The other two address concerns of persecuted scholars or scientists more generally. The National Academies also has a Committee for Human Rights that takes up individual cases, and all of their work is done not publicly, but rather diplomatically. So these are organizations that you could approach if you're aware of an individual who needs some kind of assistance or work on their behalf. Another question: does the LSA coordinate any action to support linguists in such situations? Certainly in the case of Abdouali Ayoup that Michel mentioned, the LSA was active on his behalf and coordinating with other relevant organizations. So the LSA has played that role. I'm sure there are criteria they have in place to determine when to take action and what action, but they have done so in the past. So let's then move on. Let's turn to another connection between linguistics and human rights and explore how linguists contribute to building a constituency for human rights. As part of its leadership role within the Linguistic community, the Linguistic Society of America has joined in an initiative of AAAS to build a network of scientific and engineering societies that recognize a role for scientists and engineers in human rights. As Professor Michel DeGraff mentioned before, this webinar is a product of their involvement. The coalition is comprised of both scientific membership organizations as well as affiliated individuals, including students, and addresses issues ranging from the welfare of scientists to ethics and human rights, as well as the integration of human rights into STEM education. In each instance, the coalition aims to build and sustain bridges between the scientific and human rights communities. For those of you who are interested in learning more about the coalition, the work it does, its goals and impact, you're certainly very welcome to attend the next coalition meeting, which will take place at AAAS headquarters in Washington, D.C. on July 16-17. And the focus of our discussions will be the topic of business and human rights. If you're a student, graduate or undergraduate, you're invited to participate in the coalition student poster and essay competitions. Both competitions are currently open. The winners will be announced at the coalition meeting. If you want more information about that, you can just Google AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition and find that information. As members of the Linguistic Society of America or some other professional scientific society, there are various ways you can engage in human rights. As has occurred in many associations in the past few years, you can organize an annual meeting session or publish on a topic related to the connections between linguistics and human rights, thereby engaging more members, more colleagues and members of your community in this issue. Or you can take up an issue such as language and education, hold a public inquiry in a relevant community based on linguistic research. And that research and the inquiry can inform the discussion on how, for example, the suppression of indigenous languages or the imposition of other languages is impacting the human rights of a given community. That's a brief review of how linguists can serve as a constituency for human rights. Do you have other ideas you might like to share or questions about the coalition and how to become involved? We'd like to take a few questions, and so please remember to ask your questions by typing them into the question. We have an interesting comment by one of our participants who says, from her experience in field linguistics, particularly documentation, it can be a tricky gray area when linguists are also missionaries. I think that's an important point to make when linguists may not only be researchers, but may also be serving.
Yes, and I agree, Jessica, and we'll be coming back to this point soon when it comes to how human rights have a relationship to the work that we linguists do.
We also have another comment here from Alison Reed, who's the head of the Linguistic Society. And she said, for example, linguists can oppose bad policy proposals that impinge on language rights.
Indeed. In fact, I think 3 of the cases that we'll be looking at soon concern exactly that question. So.
Wonderful. Well, then why don't we move on to those examples? So we're going to do that by looking at the value and need for linguists to apply your expertise to human rights. And I want to start off by giving you some examples of the ways in which scientists across many different disciplines have contributed to human rights through our work at AAAS. As you can see through the examples on the slide, AAAS began work in this area in the 1980s with the application of forensic anthropology and genetic sciences to identify persons in mass graves following civil conflicts in Latin America. Currently, we have on staff 3 experts who conduct geospatial image analysis to document and monitor human rights violations in parts of the world too remote or dangerous for robust on-the-ground reporting. What's important now, though, is to broaden the engagement of scientists and engineers in human rights work. At AAAS, we're going about doing that through something we call On-Call Scientists. Essentially, this is an online dating service we offer for matching human rights organizations with technical experts who can assist them. We have over 800 volunteers from more than 40 countries. And of those volunteers, 3 of them are linguists, one of whom, a computational linguist, was matched on a project aimed at analyzing online documentation of human rights violations. The way the program works is that we receive requests for assistance from human rights organizations and then go through our database to find the relevant expert to match with that organization. Michel, I'm sure you have many more examples.
Yes, yes. It's like we can go back in history. And have you ever wondered where the word shibboleth comes from? Well, the answer is the Bible. I think this is one of the earliest examples of a human rights violation based on language, actually in this case on dialectal differences. As the Bible stories goes, the rivalry between the tribe of Gilead and the tribe of Ephraim had a linguistic correlate. The Gileadites pronounced the word shibboleth as shibboleth, with a sh as in shoe. But the Ephraimites pronounced shibboleth with an S, as in su, shibboleth. In the Bible story, the Ephraimites and Gileadites fought a bloody battle, at the end of which the Gileadites decided to massacre the Ephraimites. But since they both were of the same Semitic tribe and look alike, one way to tell them apart was through shibboleth. Gileadite sentries would ask soldiers to pronounce shibboleth, and those who could say shibboleth, who could not say shibboleth, and who said shibboleth were killed. 42,000 of them. Well, there have since been many cases of shibboleth giving rise to more genocides, legal convictions, rejections of asylum, and various sorts of human rights violations. One other example closer to my home is what's been called the Parsley Massacre of Haitians in the Dominican Republic in 1937. Why parsley, you may ask? Because dark-skinned people in the Dominican Republic, near the border with Haiti, who were suspected of being Haitians, would be asked to pronounce the Spanish word for parsley, perejil. That's a difficult word for Haitians like me to pronounce because of two of the consonants that don't exist in Haitian Creole. And those who could not pronounce perejil with the right consonants were killed. Some 30,000 Haitians. One modern label for shibboleth is linguistic profiling. That's a term coined by Professor John Bohr. As an African American, Professor Bohr experienced himself linguistic profiling firsthand when looking for housing in the Bay Area. He would call potential landlords on the phone and use his professional register with his mainstream, quote, standard English, unquote, accent. And he would be invited to visit a vacant apartment. Then, after showing up in person, he would suddenly be told, no vacancy. So, he decided to try this experiment, code switching between African American English and standard English. And this is what happened. When he called using standard English, he was told there were units available for rent. But when he called back using African American English, he was told no vacancy. Bingo. Professor Bohr has written a few articles about this experiment. Then his articles have inspired public service announcements for fair housing. This is a direct contribution from linguistics to human rights. As sociolinguistics reminds us, linguistic profiling happens on a daily basis, in schools, in the workplace, even in the courts. In these institutions, and much everywhere else, speech patterns are used as proxies for race or ethnicity. People still feel more comfortable discriminating against dialects or against nonverbal language modalities. Think of the word dumb in English. This sort of discrimination of the sort that is no longer acceptable about race and ethnicity is routinely portrayed in the media, in schools, in the courts. Yet, linguistic profiling may be and can be as damaging for human rights than discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. Victims of linguistic profiling, all the way back to kindergarten, can be made to feel inferior or worthless. The consequences are insidious, including school failures, criminal convictions, and other unfair treatments under the legal system. How can linguists intervene? Well, we can educate the public, landlords, educators, etc., about language variation. The goal is really to demystify differences in accents and other differences in speech patterns in the eyes or the ears of the public and of those in power. Another way to help is to make one's research accessible to policymakers. In the US, good examples of such politically engaged linguistics are works by Geneva Sutherland, my late colleague Kenneth Hale, Bill LeBove, John Wickford, Coco Bufone, John Ball, as we mentioned earlier, Lisa Green, Wayne O'Neill, Ophelia Cepeda, Ophelia Garcia, and many, many others. Some of you in attendance right now can probably cite your own work as examples of that. Here is another case where linguists are protecting human rights. This case is currently unfurling in Hawaii, and it's especially interesting for at least two reasons. One, Hawaii is the first state in the US with an indigenous language as official language. Well, that was true, and Alaska followed suit and made its own 20 indigenous languages official. In Hawaii, the official indigenous language is Hawaiian, a language that was nearly extinct in the middle 20th century. And this takes us to reason number two why Hawaii is interesting. Of all the states in the US, Hawaii has the most successful indigenous language immersion programs, Kaya Puni Hawaii. And these programs are part of the public school system since 1987. In the US, Hawaii also has the highest enrollment of children being schooled in an indigenous language. In many of these schools, the main goal is to promote Hawaiian as the primary language of the students, with English as a second language. The Hawaii case is indeed remarkable. Linguists and educators are successfully revitalizing a formerly moribund indigenous language. The most remarkable result is that the more the schools use Hawaiian as the medium of instruction, the more successful the children get. One of the most successful schools is the Hawaii School, where Hawaiian is, by and large, the exclusive language of instruction, even for teaching English. A recent paper by Professor William Pilla Wilson, a linguist at the University of Hawaii in Hilo, tells us that the Hawaii School has had 15 straight years of 100%. Almost 89% of its graduates go to college right after high school, and some of them even make it to a PhD, one in Oxford. 98% of the students at the Hawaii School are native Hawaiian, and 1/3 of them are exposed to Hawaiian from birth. In spite of this remarkable success, Hawaiian language immersion schools, Kaya Puni Hawaii, have run into a major legal challenge, which threatens the children's civil and cultural rights. This challenge, by the way, also violates US federal law, namely the Native American Language Act of 1990, which we call NALA. Title I of the No Children Left Behind Act, or NCLB, asks that Hawaiian children be tested in English. According to NCLB, there has to be one single battery of tests per state, and these tests have to be in English. So Hawaiian students who learn content exclusively in Hawaiian are being forced to take official tests in English. Linguists, educators, and attorneys have created a national coalition of Native American language schools in order to protect indigenous language immersion programs such as Kaya Puni Hawaii. This alliance is working to ensure that the No Children Left Behind Act will not leave behind Hawaiian children. So the coalition is working on protecting No Children Left Behind Act, which violates civil rights as well as specific Native American language rights. Indeed, According to NALA, Hawaiian children have the right to be taught in the native indigenous language, so they should be exempt of any exam that evaluates them in a language that is different from the language of instruction. Such exams cannot be deemed to be fair and reliable, and this is contrary to the, quote, professional standards, unquote, that NCLB requires. Now, let's travel from the Pacific to the Atlantic, to my home country of Haiti. There too, we are engaged in a struggle for human rights, one that started way back when, with the Haitian Revolution of 1791. Like in Hawaii, the struggle is being fought around language, among other things. And like in Hawaii, language, in this case Haitian Creole or Creole, can be used for domination or its opposite, to subvert structures of domination that have been inherited from the French colonial period. In Haiti, like in Hawaii, too many children are penalized for just speaking their native language. I myself, as a Haitian child, along with my friends, as part of a French Catholic school in the 70s, we were physically punished for speaking our native language, Creole. Things have changed a bit since then. Haitian Creole has now become an official language in 1987. The situation in Haiti may actually be even worse than that of Hawaii. At least in Hawaii, even though the numbers are small, there are some 2,400 children being educated in their native language from K to 12. But Haiti is not so lucky, in spite of the law. In fact, what we have there is really a state of linguistic apartheid. Most laws, most decrees, most legal documents, most textbooks, most exams, and more are written in French only. Yet everyone in Haiti speaks Creole, and the vast majority, more than 9 million, speak Creole only. And there is only a tiny percentage, less than 5%, no more than 500,000 Haitians who can fluently speak both French and Creole. So, what can linguists do? Before we answer that question, let's consider the hard fact that most Haitians are, by and large, being educated and ruled in a language that they do not speak. So except for the small percentage who speaks fluent French, there is a robust language barrier that excludes Haitians from access to quality education, to economic opportunity, and to fair treatment under the law. This amounts to a daily violation of human rights. To counter this challenge, as a linguist, I've created a team with colleagues at MIT and in Haiti, including leaders in the current government. We currently have a major grant from the National Science Foundation Haiti Initiative. We are teaching and developing state-of-the-art digital tools in Creole for active learning of science and mathematics. We're introducing these tools to Haitian faculty through a workshop series that started back in 2012. In so doing, we're documenting the importance of Creole for improving education. And now we have solid data from teachers reporting that the teaching has improved with their use of active learning resources in Creole. There is one important ingredient that the MIT Haiti Initiative and Kayapuni Hawaii have in common. This ingredient is captured in the painting on this slide that you're watching. The slide says, "À Creole, la science fait des cabesses," which means Creole plus science equal a win-win combination. And this saying can be made much more general as local language plus education is a win-win combination. In both Hawaii and Haiti, linguists and educators are subverting the neo-colonial structures of domination that violate human rights. In both cases, these structures include the widespread belief that the community's local language would lower the quality of education. But in both Hawaii and in Haiti now, we're showing that local community languages are indeed indispensable to improve education and to protect human rights. The argument for the Haiti case is summarized in a recent New York Times article with the title, "A Creole Solution." Now, let's go to one last case study, south of the US border. Let's look at a case that is endemic of indigenous languages in the Americas and many other places in the world. There's actually one common thread from unfair housing in California to Hawaii to Haiti and now to Mexico, having to do with one major legacy of colonialism. In all these cases, we are dealing with larger structures of domination, exclusion, some of which operate through the exclusion of certain languages. In the Mexico case, the barriers for exclusion are all too literal. First, more than 8,000 indigenous people are in Mexican jail, and they do not speak Spanish, which is the language of the courts. The majority of these 8,000 plus Mexicans don't even know why they are in jail, as they have no access to interpreters. In the entire country of Mexico, there are only 28 bilingual public defenders for about 68 indigenous communities and some 364 varieties of these indigenous languages. This case is particularly challenging. Because of time constraints, I leave it open for now and ask, what can linguists do to help, especially considering the challenges of 364 language varieties? They is informed by the same premises that inform the human rights movement. Many of these intersecting premises are laid out in LSA's statement on language rights dated 1996. Here are two of these shared premises which frame the guarantees laid out in the LSA statement: the concern for equality and due process, and two, a respect for linguistic heritage. The ethics statement of the LSA also reflects shared concerns of the human rights community. For example, here are three such guidelines. 1. Respect your research subjects. 2. Ensure the involvement of the communities in any research that affects them. 3. Pay attention to the social and political implications of your research.
Let's take another poll to see how many of those participating in this webinar would be interested in applying your skills for human rights. 2% of our participants have said no, and we have 14% who said it depends. And obviously I think that's a valid response, because depending on the research questions that you're seeking to address, or the work that you're conducting, if it may not be research, it may not be appropriate or applicable to address human rights and further human rights in the work that you're doing. But 83.6% of our respondents have said that they would like to frame their work in ways that inform and further human rights goals. Let's then move to the next section. We have several questions that have come in, and we'll have an opportunity to respond to those in a moment. So we want to take the flip side of the coin. We've looked at how linguists can apply their voices and skills for human rights, but it's also important to consider what the human rights implications are of how linguists. So as just mentioned, though not drawing explicitly from human rights, the Linguistic Society of America's ethics statement includes several human rights related concepts. For example, linguists should take into account the community's cultural norms and values. The aims of an investigation should be clearly discussed with the community, and community involvement sought from the earliest stages of project planning. The statement includes a general non-discrimination clause. What I found interesting when I read this clause was that it doesn't actually explicitly mention language, but it does identify other grounds for potential discrimination that should be prohibited, including race, marital status, gender, religion. It also says that linguists have a responsibility to consider the social and political implications of their research. Michel.
Yes. Here I'd like to add that we linguists were working on less familiar languages, and I think there are quite a few of you here listening. So languages like indigenous languages or Creole languages face a particularly difficult sociological challenge. And I'd like to argue that as human beings, no matter how liberal our credentials are, we too are perforce part of these very structures of domination and exclusion that we talked about before. These structures often implicitly act against these interests of these communities where we do our research. Take, say, the case I know best, research on my native Haitian Creole and other Creole languages. All the while I myself was a student from kindergarten to my PhD, from Haiti to the University of Pennsylvania and now at MIT, it took me a while to realize the implications of our terminology and basic assumptions about these Creole languages. Consider, for example, the very language that is used to speak about Creole languages. Such meta-language includes terms such as abnormal language, impaired languages, handicapped languages, and so on. Yes, I would like to argue that we should be especially critical and self-critical about any epistemological barrier that is drawn a priori around any group of languages, especially when these languages that we draw those barriers around are spoken by people with less power. Of course, it could be that certain or all Creole languages or certain or all indigenous languages could turn out to have some special property that makes them exceptional. That could be. But we should be especially careful to consider evidence to the contrary, as we must remember that many of these claims originate in structures of power or domination, or regimes of truth, as Foucault would say it. And these structures were built at the onset to dominate the people who spoke those languages that we study. And sometimes those barriers and those structures of power are still with us.
Thank you, Michel. And while I talk, Dr. Michel, you might want to take a look at the many questions that have come in while you've been providing these rich examples, and we can get to those questions at the end of this section. So, a human rights-based approach to any project or any research requires an assessment of certain key issues and following certain processes. These processes include involving all affected communities in the design, development, implementation, and monitoring of a project, as suggested by the LSA's ethics statement. Involvement of all relevant groups in this way is a key factor in addressing the relevance and quality of the product arising from the project. And when working with affected communities, it's particularly key to ensure vulnerable or marginalized populations are involved. You may think you're already doing that if you're focusing on an indigenous population, for example, but within that population there may be vulnerable and marginalized groups. When designing survey tools, for example, involving women in decisions about the methods of distribution of surveys, collection of data, and confidentiality can be vital to ensuring their safety. Transparency is also a basic principle of human rights, which is tied very directly to the right to information, particularly information about projects that may or will have an effect on people and how they live their lives, and a right to influence how or whether information about the community arising from research is publicized and disseminated. Given the many ways that this approach echoes the ethical standards in linguistics that Michel outlined earlier, it makes sense for linguists to consider making their research more visibly connected to the global discourse on human rights. Since this is also important for students to remember, as you establish a record of scholarship that others will want to consult. So again, you have several opportunities for action. You can design your research protocol using an explicitly human rights-based approach and a human rights frame. Those of you who are working within an academic setting can encourage your university's institutional review board to recognize the human rights that it seeks to protect through its ethics review. Michel.
Another opportunity available to linguists is to participate in the upcoming Institute on Collaborative Language Research, which will be held in Fairbanks, Alaska in June to July 2016. CoLang, as it is known, provides an opportunity for a diverse range of participants to become trained in the wide range of skills in community-centered language documentation.
Many of you have sent in questions. Michel, have you had an opportunity to review?
There are lots and lots of interesting questions. So one of them asks if Hawaiian children are not left behind and they are tested in Hawaiian, will this we subsequently have language deficits that would impede the success in college, for example, at the University of Hawaii. So actually, what has been shown in one of the best schools where they use Hawaiian immersion programs is that not only you have a higher rate of graduation, in this particular case, 100% is the graduation rate, plus the kids go on almost 90% into college. And as they pick up English as a second language, the English actually becomes even better than those kids who go to English schools who are from Hawaiian backgrounds. Because what those schools in Hawaiian do for the children is not only give them skills in their own language, but it builds a sense of confidence that allows them to succeed doing a PhD at Oxford University. And this case in Hawaii is similar to cases in Europe. Think of, for example, of countries like Finland or Sweden or Norwegian. I mean, those are small communities that actually learn in schools in the native language, and they learn English as second languages. If you consider, Japan, at MIT right here, we have lots of very brilliant students from Japan, but they studied in Japanese and they studied English as a second language. So in fact, what we see is that those students who are learning in the native language, they might perform even better in English and other fields like math and science than others.
Thank you, Michel. I think we have time for one more question before we go to the final section of our webinar and the final Q&A. While Michel is reviewing the many questions that have been directed at him, I want to just share with the group a comment that was made by one of our participants who said that the situation in Haiti is true for most of the Arab-speaking world. The country is not fluent in modern standard Arabic. Thank you for sharing that. Michel, is there one last question you want to respond to before?
Yeah, there's one last question about what to do in cases like Guatemala, where because they contrast the case of Haiti and Hawaii, where there is just one local language, with cases like Guatemala, where there might be 22 local languages. And one can also think of Africa, where there might be even more in each country. And whether is what happens if we don't. If we don't use those native languages, the students just fail. They just cannot succeed. So it takes an initial investment to produce materials in each of these local languages, but the outcome eventually makes it worth it. Because if you don't do it, the cost is much higher, where you leave the vast majority of indigenous speakers out in ignorance, and they fail academically, which has larger consequences for the society. So the initial investment might be quite a bit to produce materials in each of these local languages, but in the long term, it's advantageous. And if we think of Europe, for example, Europe sets us a beautiful example where, look at Finland. Finland, for a long time, was failing its children because these children were being educated in Swedish when most of those kids, they spoke Finnish at home. Once they made that switch from using Swedish as a primary language of instruction to using Finnish, now Finland is #1 in many international scores when it comes to education. So one could locate one of the factors for that success of Finland to having switched to the native language, you see? And so one could extrapolate from that to argue that, yes, in in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Latin America, the value of this investment to produce tools in the native language is worth it.
Thank you, Michel.
Eventually.
Well, I think then we need to move on to our final section, and as I said, there'll be one last opportunity for Q&A. And our final topic is the human right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. The right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications is contained in one of the legal treaties we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. That's the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Indeed, a covenant does much more than talk about the right to science. It also talks about the duty on governments to conserve, develop, and diffuse science, to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research, and to encourage international contacts and cooperation. The most significant inadequacy of this provision, frankly, is that we don't know what it means yet. The right has been broadly accepted through ratification of the treaty, incorporation into other international documents, even national constitutions. However, if the right is going to be applied, and as someone in their question asked, if it's going to be really implemented and enforced, and if it's going to have impact, we need to define it. So UNESCO began a process in 2007, working with a group of lawyers and human rights experts, as well as ethicists, to explore the meaning of the right. And that process culminated in a set of preliminary conclusions which acknowledged that the scientific as well as the academic communities needed to be brought into the process of defining a right. And so it was to that end that AAAS, the Science and Human Rights Coalition, studying the perspectives of scientists and engineers about the meaning and application of the right. In total, over 18 months, we held 17 focus groups. And this table shows the disciplines represented in the focus group data, including linguists. It's important to note the relative lack of representation from the engineering community, but also the participants were all US-based scientists. This table lists the 10 most frequently mentioned benefits of science in those focus groups, and it's worth pointing out a few general observations about the findings. First, when discussing Article 15 in human rights circles, medicine, agriculture, and the internet are often the only 3 benefits of science that are mentioned. But in our focus groups, a much broader array of benefits were discussed by scientists from multiple disciplinary backgrounds. In addition, when presenting these findings, surprise has often been expressed that the economic impact of science was only the 10th most frequently mentioned benefit of the science, and not much higher in the list. And I'm sure that relates to the fact that our focus group participants were scientists, whose focus tends to be on the production of knowledge or applying knowledge to solve problems, rather than making money or building economies. So these findings constitute one of the 2 major contributions of our research to the process of defining the right to science. The second, which we can discuss in the Q&A if you're interested, concerns the question of access to the benefits of science, precisely to what people need access and the tools and mechanisms for ensuring access. This table lists the 4 most commonly coded themes that emerged in the linguistics focus group, and compares them with the 4 most commonly coded themes in all preliminary and limited set of findings. This summary does reveal the issues and concerns that appear to be the most salient for the linguistic focus group participants as they consider the benefits of scientific progress in linguistics and their applications, as well as the corresponding responsibilities of governments related to scientific freedom, international contacts and cooperation, and the conservation, development, and diffusion of science. By way of just one illustration, and there's certainly a lot more information about this that I could share, within the context of prejudice, bias, discrimination, which was the most commonly coded, commonly tagged code in the linguistic focus groups, the issues raised included governmental discrimination based on language, as well as institutional bias. One participant considered a benefit of linguistics to be that it, quote, shows that different varieties of speech, dialects, etc., are valid communicative systems and equal in their structures, even though some may be socially stigmatized. In October of 2013, my colleague Margaret Vitullo of the American Sociological Association and I presented the findings of this study to the UN. The report was well received and is helping shape the ongoing work within the UN to define the right to science. The task ahead of us now is to internationalize our study and bring the global perspectives of scientists and engineers to the task of determining what the right to science means, what are the barriers to its realization, and how to overcome those barriers.
It is important to note that we do not do our research in a political vacuum. Kudos go to the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition for identifying and advancing ways in which people can benefit from the advancement of science.
Thank you, Michel. And well, with that brings us to the end of the formal part of today's proceedings. But before we open up the discussion for a final time, I wanted to review some of the opportunities for action that we've discussed today. As we mentioned, you can write letters or take other appropriate action on behalf of linguists whose rights have been violated. You can attend, participate, compete as a student in our student and poster competitions, and attend the meetings of the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition. You can join the On-Call Scientist Network. As I mentioned, we have just 3 linguists, and it would be wonderful to be able to boost those numbers. We can work with your association to organize sessions on linguistics and human rights, or publish in the Society's newsletter or your campus newsletter. Write journal articles on the connection. What about teaching human rights as they relate to linguistics in the courses that you teach? I might also suggest considering a review of the LSA's ethics statement to determine the value of incorporating human rights into the statement explicitly. So as we come to the end of our webinar, you have just one last chance for questions. And we have several questions that have come in. Michel, are there any that you would like to answer before we...
Well, there are so many of them that are so good. So I've been going through the questions, and it's very hard to pick since I only have to... It's your time. So go ahead, Jessica. I'm going to look at some of them and decide which ones I can pick. I want to.
Well, we have that. We do actually have our contact information available for you. If you'd like to follow up on any of your questions, please feel free to email either of us directly.
Well, there's one question here that asks, how can we, linguists, actually pick particular languages to help advance human rights when there are many of them that might deserve our attention? And this is a hard question. In my case, given my own history in Haiti, what made me automatically work in Haitian Creole after I became a linguist was because I knew firsthand what they did from the school system, but I saw firsthand among the children how they were being penalized on a daily basis just because of the native language. They would go to school and not be able to use the knowledge of the language, but also not being able to participate in this opportunity to improve the sort. So for me, Haiti was a natural decision, and I think that once we create enough examples of best practice, like in the Hawaii case, in the Finnish case, so the case of Finland is one in Europe, but yet we have similar issues there, where for a long time Finnish native speakers were being dominated and discriminated against by Swedish speakers, and now that they've changed the linguistic pattern, now they're using Finnish in the schools, and Finland now is one of the best schools the school system is one of the best in Europe. And so I think that we have to go with our hearts and our opportunities and do the best we can.
I want to thank Michel as my co-presenter, and also thank again the Linguistic Society of America for its leadership in engaging its members on issues of human rights. That concludes our webinar, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.